Chapter 20. A New Friend. Mrs. Kirk had a big house and gave Joe the sky parlor with a stove and table. It was the perfect place to sit and write. The two little girls she was to teach were sweet, gentle children. Soon after Joe arrived, she noticed a gentleman boarder also living at the Kirks. He had a foreign accent. She later learned from Mrs. Kirk that the man was Mr. Frederick Bayer, a professor from Berlin. He was a stout man with tousled brown hair, a bushy beard, and kind eyes. He looked like a wealthy gentleman, though his coat was missing 2 buttons and his shoe had been patched. Jo spent her days teaching, sewing, and writing up in her tiny room. She was finally introduced to Mr. Bayer one day, then noticed him on her way out a day later. He was standing in his doorway, holding a sock and a sewing needle. She laughed all the way downstairs, but thought it was sad that he had to mend his own clothes. One day soon after, Mrs. Kirk called after Jo as she passed Mr. Bayer's room. "Did you ever see such a room, my dear?" she asked. "Come help me tidy it up. I've turned everything upside down searching for the handkerchiefs he's asked me to mend." Jo gazed around the cluttered room. Books and papers were everywhere. "Such a man!" Mrs. Kirk exclaimed with a laugh. "I agreed to do his washing and mending, but he forgets to leave his things for me." "Let me mend them," Jo said. "I'd really like to do it for him. He seems like such a nice man." When Mr. Bayer found out, he offered to teach Jo German in return for the mending. It wasn't long before Jo and Mr. Bayer became good friends. On New Year's Day, he gave her a book because he knew how much she loved to read. Not having much money, Jo got him several little things for his room in return for the thoughtful gesture. Though very busy with her new job with the Kirks, Jo still found time for her writing. She dreamed of filling her home with comforts, giving Beth everything she wanted, and someday going abroad herself. So she took to writing short sensation stories because they paid well. Jo took one of those stories to a paper called The Weekly Volcano. The editor agreed to publish it, but asked that in the future she make her stories shorter and spicier. She did, and week after week her stories appeared in the paper. Her name, by request, never appeared with her stories. She saved the money she earned to take Beth to the mountains next summer. Jo and Mr. Bayer became even closer. She respected the professor immensely. One day, during a conversation, Mr. Bayer said he found the short sensation stories in the Weekly Volcano pure trash. Jo knew deep down that he was right. Of course, Mr. Bayer hadn't known Jo had written those stories, for she hadn't told anyone, but she was ashamed just the same. She decided at that moment she wouldn't waste any more time writing such stories. She went to her room that evening and stuffed all her papers and short story ideas into the burning stove. After that, she never wrote a sensation story again. Jo stayed with the Kirks until June, when she returned home for Laurie's college graduation. "You won't forget to come visit, will you?" she asked Mr. Bayer on the day she was leaving. "I'll never forget you if you forget, for I want my family to know my friend." On the ride back home, Jo stared out the window and thought about the past few months. "Well," she said to herself, "the winter's gone, and I've written no books and earned no fortune. But I've made a friend worth having, and I'll try to keep him all my life."